So this guy saved hundreds of people from a bomb blast, and then the entire world turned against him. Now, the guy's name is Richard Jewell, and Richard's 33 years old. He's a security guard working in Atlanta, Georgia, and one summer night in 1996, he's working the graveyard shift at the Summer Olympics, which happened to be going on in Atlanta that year. It's July 27, 1996, and Richard is posted up in this massive park called Centennial Olympic Park. This place was designed to be like the town square of the Olympics, a huge gathering space where thousands of spectators are hanging out, eating from concession stands, listening to live music on big stages, and just soaking up the Olympic atmosphere. The park is absolutely packed with people, families, tourists from all over the world, all there to celebrate the games. Richard's working for AT&T as a private security guard. He's not some highly trained federal agent or anything. He's just a regular guy trying to make a living doing his job, walking around this park making sure everything stays safe and orderly. And while he's patrolling around 1 a.m. in the morning, Richard notices something that doesn't sit right with him. There's this group of drunk people hanging out near a park bench, and they're being loud and obnoxious. They're like throwing trash on the ground, being disruptive, just generally causing problems in this family-friendly Olympic environment. So Richard, being the conscientious security guard that he is, goes over to confront them about their behavior. Hey, you guys need to clean up your act, Richard tells them. This is a family event and you're being disruptive. The drunk people don't want to deal with security, so they leave. But when they leave behind a green military-style backpack sitting under the park bench. Richard's like, hey, you left your bag. And they're like, that's not our bag, you turd. We've never seen that thing before in our lives. So Richard starts thinking about this situation. This bag's been sitting here for like 30 minutes now, and no one has come to claim it. In the back of his mind, he's thinking about all the security briefings he's had about the Olympics, about how this is a high-profile international event, about how there could be threats. And I have no idea why he immediately thinks it might be a bomb, but you know what? He does. It's a little paranoid maybe, but sometimes paranoia saves lives. So Richard radios his supervisors. I think there might be a bomb in this bag, he tells them. We need to check this out. His supervisors take him seriously, and they call the bomb squad over to investigate. The bomb squad is on their way, but here's the thing. Richard doesn't know it yet, but he's actually right. There is a bomb inside that bag. Not just one bomb, but 3 pipe bombs, actually. And they're stuffed full of shrapnel, nails, screws, metal fragments, all designed to cause maximum damage to human bodies when they explode. While the bomb squad is making their way through the crowded park, an ATF agent arrives on the scene first. This agent gets down on the ground with a flashlight and starts examining the suspicious backpack. He's looking at it carefully, professionally, and after a few tense moments, this dude's like, yep, that's definitely a bomb. Suddenly, everything changes. Richard and everyone around him starts to panic. A lot of people in the immediate area start running away as fast as they can. But Richard, and this is what makes him a hero, Richard doesn't run. Instead, he starts running around the park trying to clear out the area as quickly as possible. There's a bomb. Get out of the way. There's a bomb, he's shouting, running up to as many people as possible, telling them to get away from the backpack. Move back. Everyone needs to move back right now. And you know what? It's actually working. Little by little, person by person, the crowd starts to back up and move away from the danger zone. Richard is literally saving lives in real time, getting people to safety, creating distance between innocent civilians and this deadly device. But then, all of a sudden, kaboom! One of the bombs goes off, and it's absolute chaos. The explosion is deafening, shrapnel flies everywhere. People are screaming and running for their lives. The blast sends metal fragments shooting through the air like bullets, and they hit people. The scene is like something out of a war zone. The bomb exploded, killing 1 woman and injuring 112. The woman who died was named Alice Hawthorne, and she was struck in the head by a nail from the bomb. A photojournalist also died after suffering a heart attack while running to cover the event. This cameraman was so excited to film the explosion that he literally ran toward the danger, had a heart attack from excitement and exertion, and died right there. Overall, 2 people died and 111 were wounded. But Richard Jewell actually saved a bunch of lives that day by evacuating everyone beforehand. Thanks to Jewell, it only killed 2 and wounded 111, not the hundreds who authorities estimated could have otherwise died. Without his quick thinking and decisive action, the death toll could have been absolutely catastrophic. Immediately, this bombing becomes massive international news. We're talking about the Olympics here. The whole world is watching. The story blows up across every media outlet on the planet. CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, every newspaper, every magazine, everyone is covering this terrorist attack at the Olympics. And suddenly, the media starts calling Richard Jewell a hero. He's getting invited to do TV interviews like on CNN, where he says things like, "I just hope that we catch the people that did this." He's this unlikely security guard who suddenly became an international hero. The man literally deserves a medal for what he did. For 3 whole days, Richard Jewell is the toast of Atlanta, of the country, even the world. He's being praised by everyone, politicians, law enforcement, ordinary citizens. People are calling him a hero, a lifesaver, someone who put his own safety at risk to protect innocent people. For 3 days, Jewell was the toast of Atlanta, of the country, even the world. But then, unfortunately for him, not everyone thinks Richard is a hero. Pretty quickly, one of Richard's former employers sees him being interviewed on CNN, and this guy doesn't like what he sees. He apparently just doesn't like Richard personally. Maybe he thought Richard was overzealous or weird or something when he worked for him. And so this former employer, driven by personal dislike or maybe just wanting attention, calls in a tip to the FBI. "I think Richard Jewell planted the bomb himself," he tells them. Now, the FBI has been investigating this bombing case, and they're under enormous pressure. This is the Olympics, the whole world is watching, and they need to solve this case quickly or they're going to look really bad at their job. The media is asking questions, politicians are demanding answers, and they don't have a lot of solid leads. So they get this tip about Richard, and they start thinking, maybe it was this Richard guy who planted the bomb himself. The idea is that maybe he planted it so he could discover it and look like a hero. It's called the hero bomber theory. The idea that someone would commit a crime just so they could solve it and get praise. The FBI starts investigating Richard Jewell, and when journalists hear about this investigation, the story explodes all over again. But this time, the narrative is completely different. Every news outlet starts talking about how Richard Jewell, the supposed hero security guard, is actually the prime suspect in the bombing. They start running with this whole story that he probably planted the bomb himself so that he could come across as a hero. The media goes absolutely crazy with this story. They're chasing him around everywhere he goes. "Can you stop for a second, please? Did you plant the bomb? Where were you when the bomb went off? Are you a terrorist?" Richard is staying in his mother's apartment. He actually lives with his mom, which the media portrays as somehow suspicious or weird. Look at the media just camped out outside his mother's apartment building, trying to get pictures of him, trying to talk to him, shoving microphones in his face every time he tries to leave. Suddenly, this guy can't go anywhere without being harassed. During all this media circus, Richard is still doing interviews, but now they're confrontational. Reporters are literally accusing him of terrorism to his face. "You categorically say that you did not do this," they ask him. "I did not do this categorically, yes," Richard responds. The media coverage becomes absolutely vicious. They're treating him like he's already been convicted, like he's definitely guilty. And during all this, Richard is seeing newspaper headlines about himself calling him a suspected terrorist. I don't know if you ever saw this, but there were headlines basically calling him the Olympic bomber. "No, I'm sorry, I didn't see it," Richard says when asked about a particularly nasty headline. "What's your reaction to it?" "Probably sold some paper that day," he responds, showing remarkable restraint given the circumstances. Meanwhile, the FBI wants to bring Richard in for questioning, but they want to trick him into coming in without a lawyer. They know that if he has legal representation, it's going to be much harder for them to get him to say something incriminating. So they come up with this elaborate scheme. They call Richard up and tell him, "We think you're a hero. We want to honor what you did." They explain that they're making a training video about the bombing for future FBI agents to study, and they invite him to come to the FBI building in Atlanta to help them make this educational video. Poor, naive Richard believes them. He thinks they genuinely want to thank him and learn from what happened. So he agrees to come in. "All right, I'll help you guys out," he says. So Richard goes to the FBI offices in Atlanta, and they start asking him all kinds of questions. But they're playing it real cool, like this is all just for the training video they're supposedly making. They're asking him about the timeline, about what he saw, about his actions, all while making it seem like they're just gathering information for educational purposes. Then one of the agents says, "We want to make this training video as realistic as possible. Just pretend you're a suspect, and I'll read you your Miranda rights, and we'll record it for the video." And so this FBI agent starts reading Richard his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." And that's when Richard realizes something isn't right. The pieces start clicking together in his mind. Wait a minute. Why would they need to read me my rights for a training video? Richard uses their phone and calls up a friend of his who happens to be a lawyer. His lawyer friend immediately understands what's happening. "I see what they're doing here," the lawyer tells him. "This isn't about any training video. They're trying to interrogate you. You get the hell out of that building right now, Richard." So Richard leaves the FBI building, and they don't get any answers from him. But unfortunately for Richard, the FBI isn't done with him yet. They really seem convinced that he's their guy, and they're determined to find evidence to prove it. Pretty quickly, they get a search warrant for his apartment. They show up at his place and completely tear it apart for 7 hours straight. They're looking for bomb-making materials, for evidence that he's some kind of terrorist, for anything that might connect him to the bombing. And they make him sit outside on the stairwell while they search, with all the media vultures surrounding him the whole time. The media is snapping candid photos of him sitting there looking defeated and depressed. There's actually a famous picture of him waiting on the stairwell looking absolutely miserable, while FBI agents ransack his home and reporters document his humiliation. Of course, the FBI doesn't find anything in their search because Richard isn't guilty of anything. There are no bomb-making materials, no evidence of terrorism, nothing that connects him to the bombing in any way. But that doesn't stop the investigation or the media coverage. This chaos goes on for nearly 3 months. The media is harassing him constantly, the FBI is investigating him, and he can't go anywhere without being accused of being a terrorist. He can't work, he can't have a normal life, he can't even sleep properly. The insomnia is partly because his apartment is constantly surrounded by reporters, with news vans and cameras and people shouting questions at all hours. But it's also partly due to PTSD from witnessing a freaking bomb go off and watching someone die from it. Remember, this guy isn't just dealing with false accusations. He's also dealing with the trauma of having been at the center of a terrorist attack. The FBI investigation becomes increasingly desperate. They're profiling Richard, trying to understand his psychology, looking for any excuse to arrest him. They study his employment history, his personality, his behavior. They're convinced that he fits the profile of a hero bomber, someone who would commit a crime just to look good solving it. But as time goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that no matter how hard they try, the FBI can't find any evidence that Richard had anything to do with the bombing. They can't find bomb-making materials, they can't find a motive, they can't find any connection between him and the attack. Every lead they follow leads nowhere. The investigation becomes an embarrassment for the FBI. They've essentially destroyed an innocent man's life based on a theory that they can't prove. They've leaked information to the media. They've violated his privacy. They've subjected him to months of harassment and suspicion, all without any real evidence. Meanwhile, Richard's life is falling apart. He can't get work because who wants to hire someone who's been accused of being a terrorist? His reputation is ruined, his mental health is suffering, and he's become a pariah in his own community. The stress is overwhelming for both him and his mother. After a long and embarrassing investigation, the Justice Department finally releases a formal statement. For months afterward, he was suspected of planting the bomb, resulting in adverse publicity that became a symbol of media and law enforcement excess. The statement confirms once and for all that Richard Jewell has been cleared of any suspicion related to the Olympic bombing. Richard is, of course, super relieved when he's finally cleared. He holds a press conference where he's clearly emotional but also angry about what he's been put through. In his rush to show the world how quickly it could get its man, "The FBI trampled on my rights as a citizen," he says, his voice shaking with emotion. But being cleared doesn't immediately fix everything. The damage to his reputation and his psyche has been enormous. He spent months being portrayed as a terrorist in the media, being treated like a criminal by law enforcement, being harassed and humiliated in public. You can't just undo that kind of trauma overnight. Richard decides to fight back legally. He files lawsuits against several media outlets for dragging his name through the mud and destroying his reputation. He sues NBC, CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and others for their irresponsible reporting. He also sues his former employer who made the initial false tip to the FBI. The lawsuits take years to resolve, but eventually, Richard gets settlement money from several of these cases. The exact amounts are often confidential, but it's reported that he received substantial settlements. He uses this money to buy himself and his mother a new house, finally giving them a fresh start away from all the negative memories. But the real vindication comes years later. In 2003, they finally catch the actual bomber. Eric Robert Rudolph, also known as the Olympic Park bomber, is an American domestic terrorist convicted of a series of bombings across the southern United States between 1996 and 1998. Eric Rudolph turns out to be a completely different kind of person than Richard Jewell. Between 1996 to 1998, bombs exploded 4 times in Atlanta and Birmingham, killing 2 and injuring hundreds. Rudolph was responsible not just for the Olympic bombing, but for a series of attacks on abortion clinics and gay nightclubs throughout the Southeast. Rudolph detailed his motives, citing a hatred for what he saw as liberal social policies. He was an anti-abortion extremist who targeted the Olympics because he saw it as promoting multiculturalism and international cooperation, which he opposed. His motivations were completely political and ideological, the exact opposite of the hero bomber theory that the FBI had pursued against Richard Jewell. He was later sentenced to 4 life terms without parole, and in August 2005 was sent to the Supermax federal prison in Florence, Colorado. Rudolph had evaded capture for years by hiding in the mountains of North Carolina, living like a survivalist, supported by a network of sympathizers who shared his extremist views. The capture of Eric Rudolph finally definitively proves that Richard Jewell was innocent. Not only was he innocent, but he was exactly what he appeared to be from the beginning. A hero who saved lives by his quick thinking and decisive action. Looking back at this case, it's clear that Richard Jewell was the victim of a perfect storm of law enforcement incompetence, media sensationalism, and public hysteria. The FBI was under enormous pressure to solve a high-profile case quickly, and they seized on the first theory that seemed plausible even without evidence. The media, hungry for a compelling story, amplified the FBI's suspicions without doing their own independent investigation. The case became a textbook example of how not to conduct a criminal investigation and how not to cover a news story. It showed the dangers of trial by media, the importance of the presumption of innocence, and the devastating consequences when law enforcement and the press get things wrong. For Richard Jewell personally, the experience was traumatic in ways that went far beyond what most people could understand. He had literally risked his life to save others, and instead of being thanked, he was vilified and suspected of the very crime he had helped prevent. The psychological impact of this betrayal was enormous. In interviews after he was cleared, Richard spoke about the lasting effects of the experience. He talked about how difficult it was to trust people again, how he had trouble sleeping, how he was constantly looking over his shoulder. The trauma of the bombing itself was compounded by the trauma of being falsely accused and publicly humiliated. But Richard also showed remarkable resilience and grace. Despite everything he had been through, he didn't become bitter or angry in the way that many people might have. He continued to work in security, he maintained his relationships with family and friends, and he even expressed sympathy for the actual victims of the bombing. Richard's mother, Bobby Jewell, also became a prominent figure in the story. She stood by her son throughout the ordeal, defending him publicly and privately. In later interviews, she described watching her son be worn, torn, and tattered by the experience, but also praised his strength and character. The Richard Jewell case became a watershed moment in American journalism and law enforcement. It led to soul-searching in newsrooms about the speed and accuracy of reporting, particularly in high-profile cases. It highlighted the dangers of unnamed sources and speculation presented as fact. For the FBI, the case was a significant embarrassment that led to changes in how they handle investigations and interact with the media. It showed the importance of keeping investigations confidential until there's actually evidence to support charges. The case also highlighted broader issues about the nature of heroism and suspicion in American society. Richard Jewell was initially celebrated as a hero, but as soon as he became a suspect, the same qualities that made him heroic, his vigilance, his attention to detail, his eagerness to help, were reinterpreted as suspicious and potentially sinister. This tendency to view heroism with suspicion, to assume that people who do good deeds must have ulterior motives, reflects something troubling about our culture. It suggests that we become so cynical that we can't accept that someone might genuinely risk their life to help others without expecting something in return. Richard Jewell's story is ultimately a story about the importance of truth, the dangers of rushing to judgment, and the resilience of the human spirit. It's a reminder that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to rewards. Sometimes it leads to persecution. But it's also a story about redemption and vindication. Richard Jewell was eventually recognized for what he truly was, a hero who saved lives at the Olympics. His reputation was restored, his innocence was proven, and the real bomber was caught and punished. The case serves as a cautionary tale for law enforcement, the media, and the public. It shows what can happen when we abandon our principles of due process and presumption of innocence in favor of sensationalism and quick fixes. It reminds us that behind every news story is a real person whose life can be destroyed by false accusations and irresponsible reporting. Richard Jewell died in 2007 at the age of 44, still relatively young. His death was attributed to complications from diabetes, but those who knew him said that the stress of the bombing and its aftermath had taken a toll on his health. Even after being cleared, he never fully recovered from the trauma of being falsely accused. At his funeral, he was remembered not as the suspected bomber that the media had portrayed him as, but as a hero he had always been. Fellow security guards, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who remembered his actions that night at the Olympics came to pay their respects. The Richard Jewell case continues to be studied and discussed more than 25 years after it happened. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, and a major motion picture directed by Clint Eastwood. These works have helped to restore Richard's reputation and remind the public of the real story, not the false narrative that dominated the news for months in 1996. The case also led to important legal precedents about the rights of suspects and the responsibilities of the media. Several of the lawsuits that Richard filed resulted in settlements that established new standards for how news organizations report on criminal investigations. In the end, Richard Jewell's story is both tragic and inspiring. It's tragic because an innocent man was put through hell for doing the right thing. But it's also inspiring because it shows that truth eventually prevails, that heroism exists even in ordinary people, and that one person's quick thinking and decisive action can save hundreds of lives. The 3 pipe bombs that Eric Rudolph planted in Centennial Olympic Park that night were designed to kill as many people as possible. If Richard Jewell hadn't noticed the suspicious backpack, if he hadn't taken seriously, if he hadn't acted quickly to clear the area, the death toll could have been catastrophic. Instead of 2 people dying and 111 being injured, hundreds could have died. So while Richard Jewell's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of false accusations and media sensationalism, it's also fundamentally a story about heroism. It's about an ordinary security guard who did an extraordinary thing, who saved lives at great personal cost, and who deserves to be remembered not as a suspect, but as a hero. The bombing at the 1996 Olympics was meant to be an act of terror, designed to spread fear and hatred. But Richard Jewell's actions that night transformed it into something else, a testament to the power of individual courage and the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, and even when the world turns against you for it. In the end, Richard Jewell got justice. The real bomber was caught and punished, Richard's name was cleared, and his heroism was recognized. It took years longer than it should have, and the cost was enormous, but truth and justice eventually prevailed. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.